Okay, good morning, everyone. Today is September 14th, and today is a little bit unusual. If you are in the 10 o'clock class, of course, you're seeing the 10 o'clock lecture. If you are in my 12 o'clock class, you will know that the campus was closed, and so there was no actual class today. But this lecture is going to be identical to what we would have done at noon, so it works for both classes, and we're there with that. Now, I want to remind everybody, we have a quiz that opens up on Thursday. This is quiz 2. So pay attention to that. The quiz must be taken by Sunday night at 8. Much of the material on the quiz we haven't covered in the lectures, as you'll know, but it is in the Canvas material. So study that Canvas material. Also be sure to participate in the discussions. So quiz Thursday. Hopefully everything will be back to normal then, and this tropical storm will be a memory, but keep all of that in mind. Also, I have another quick announcement. We have a student that is running for homecoming maid. Her name is Elena Olson. Miss Olson, come on up here. I'm going to introduce y'all to her. We are very, very encouraged. Here she is, Miss Olson. Terrific student, and certainly well-deserving of that title. And so I am probably not supposed to tell y'all who to vote for, but there's a lot of things that I'm not supposed to do. So vote for her. And if you're a freshman, and also in the event that she does become a homecoming maid, I will be adding extra points to everybody's grade on the next exam. So, yeah, there we go.
Daisha's running too.
Daisha's running. Come on up. No,
yes.
Come on up. Okay, I did not know. So, okay, here we go.
So is that extra points?
I guess it's going to have to be. I guess for every homecoming maid we have, we're going to add points to the midterm. So you're Daisha.
Yes. Hi.
Daisha Hall, and she's running for sophomore. So, all right, terrific. So, these two. Are we cool? All right, great. Absolutely. I have the absolute best students on campus, bar none. That is objective and provable. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. When we left off, we were talking about Athens. We were talking about Sparta. We were discussing the fact that the Greek culture is unique in the sense that there are a series of city-states that politically remain independent. They are unique in some aspects. Sparta, for example, was far more authoritarian. Athens, for example, was far more open and free. Every other city-state sort of had its own idiosyncrasies in that regard. But one point that we have to emphasize is that the Greeks very much valued their independence. The Greeks saw themselves as better, if you will, than all other peoples that were non-Greek, and they very much intended to keep it that way. Now, what we were not able to discuss in the lecture, but what was in the notes, and I hope that you did study this in the notes, is that Persia had grown into an immensely powerful empire by roughly the 6th century BC. Persia was put together by a man named Cyrus the Great, and his descendants would go on to build an empire that stretched from Egypt to India. And the Persians are not accustomed to losing any conflict that they got into. Now, you will recall that we talked about how the Greeks had colonized regions across the Aegean Sea to the east, and that over the centuries, these colonies had sort of been relief valves for overpopulation. And there's a lot of Greek people that live outside of mainland Greece. The whole Aegean area is more or less a Greek region. But if you look along the coast of Asia Minor there, and then we look along the borders of the Persian Empire, there's some overlap. There's some regions that Persia claims for itself, but the Greek people aren't too thrilled about that. The Greek people living along what is today the coast of Turkey didn't really accept this. It was a gray area as to who is exactly in charge. And the Greeks do not like the idea of having any connection to Persia that would require them to kneel before a Persian emperor. That is just not what the Greeks are willing to do. If you are an authoritarian leader, if you are the great emperor, one challenge that you might have are pesky people in remote areas not appreciating or respecting your law. Now, you might think to yourself, who really cares? Persia is gigantic, so there's a little bit of a coastline there where the people are not particularly loyal. If you're the emperor, what might be a problem with that? Why would you take that a lot more seriously than perhaps people might think? Why is it so important that every single person under your rule obey you without question? Well, yes, right? Sooner or later, somebody might show up to overthrow you from that region. Alexander the Great, we're not there yet, right? Now, I don't think the Persian emperor at this time was all that concerned about that, right? Again, he is a massively powerful man, huge army, et cetera, et cetera. How about this? What happens if some of these pesky Greeks can get away with thumbing their nose at the great and powerful emperor? What might happen next? Well, what happens if other people get the same idea? What happens if the Greeks can get away with it? Well, maybe the Egyptians are next, right? And then maybe this people and maybe that people. One of the rules about being the absolute ruler is you can't let anybody get away with disrespecting you, because it's a slippery slope. Bingo, that's it. It's that slippery slope. Well, anyway, Persia had a very effective policy of dealing with foreign people that it wanted to take care of. And Persia had grown by simply annexing regions. And most of the time, people joined Persia voluntarily because they knew they couldn't resist anyway. And of course, when you join Persia, there's a lot of benefits. You get economic benefits and protection from the army, et cetera, et cetera. So there we have it. Well, the Emperor Darius, in about the year 490, finally concluded that he had had enough dealing with these pesky Greeks. And the solution was to bring Greece into his empire. He is simply going to annex Greece just like the empire had done plenty of times before to other people. And if you look at the size of the Persian Empire and you look at the size of Greece, it doesn't look like this is going to be all that difficult. It's pretty clear, who is the elephant and who is the mouse in this type of arrangement. But the Greeks were firm. We will not become Persian. The Greeks sent the message very clearly to Emperor Darius. The answer is no. And all those Greeks along that coastline of the Aegean, even though they are in Persia, in their mind, not so much. These people were particularly close to Athens. They had a closer relationship with Athens than any other part of the Greek world. And the Athenians encouraged them to resist Persian domination. Well, we can see where this is going to go, so let's just go ahead and fast forward. Darius concludes that the solution will simply be to send an army to Greece and conquer it. And since these difficult people are for the most part Athenian or Athenian allies, it should be pretty easy to just stomp Athens out and the rest of Greece will fall in line. If I send an army and I just take care of that city-state of Athens, the other Greeks are not going to give me any trouble. And it is clearly obvious that there is no way the Greeks could win a bona fide war with Persia. This is a elephant versus a mouse. This is David versus Goliath. You get the idea. Athens is one city-state against the Persian Empire. Darius did not need to send the entire Persian army. You don't send the whole army for such a small operation. There's plenty of spying that is going on either side, so everybody has a general idea of what the deal is. Now, the numbers that I'm giving you are estimates. They're not perfect. The sources are a little vague on this. But the best estimates were that if Athens armed and trained as much as it could field 10,000 soldiers. Athens could field 10,000 soldiers. Knowing this, Darius sent a force twice that size. So the Persians send 20,000 soldiers, and the Athenians have 10,000 to meet them. And the Persians firmly believe that Athens will probably just surrender rather than fight. It is absurd to think that the Athenians would even try to resist this, realizing that if this 20,000 doesn't work, he can send more. Athens is a very well-protected harbor, and the Greeks have fought plenty of wars over the centuries with each other. So sailing his fleet into Athens is going to not work. But north of Athens are some gently sloping plains that kind of go right into the water, a very nice little beach, which is the perfect place for boats at this time to move up and the men can hop off and wade ashore. This is 26 miles north of Athens. It is a place known as Marathon. It's a place known as Marathon. Now, everybody knows what's going on, and there's plenty of spies on each side. So the Athenians knew that Marathon is the place. But just understanding the geography would tell the Athenians that if an army is going to land, it will have to land at Marathon. Now, I want you to put yourself in the mindset of the Athenian leadership. Knowing that you have this vastly bigger army coming, and refusing to surrender to them, which would have been the easy way to avoid bloodshed, but the Greeks are not going to do that. What strategy might you take? What might you do if you're sitting around and realizing these guys are trying to conquer Greece, they're going to use us as the example, and they're sending an army that's twice as big as anything we can put together? What might be some strategies you do? Now understand, there's no wrong answer here. I'm not trying to bait y'all. Maybe you should make some friends. Hey, there we go, right? Athens is not the only city-state in Greece with an army, of course, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to all the other city-states and point out the obvious. The Persians are coming for all of us. They're not just coming for Athens. Common sense says that. Now would be a good time to work together. Now, if you're going to make friends and you want to ally with a really powerful army, who do you turn to? Sparta. There is no question, man for man, the Spartans are the best army in the ancient world. Now, they're not a big army, it's a city-state, but this is a group of guys that you would want fighting on your side. They are the Spartans. So Athens turned to Sparta, made it clear. We're not friends, we know that. We fought a lot over the years. Now would be a good time for us to put our differences aside and face a common enemy. Sparta refused, would not do it. Then you would think, well, why would Sparta not step up when it's obvious that now would be the time to do it? But Sparta said, no, we're not helping you. And without Spartan support, none of the other city-states would support Athens either. So Athens has to face the Persians alone. Well, what did the Athenians start doing? Well, if you're not bigger and stronger than your opponent, what do you need to be? You got to be smarter. If you're not going to be bigger and stronger, you're going to have to be smarter. What the Athenians did is they would take those 10,000 soldiers and put all of their armor on them, get all their weapons together, get in a big field, and pick a spot way over there and just run to it as fast as they could. And then when they got there, they would catch their breath, drink a little water, point to the spot that they ran from, and run all the way back in their armor. And they did that all day long, every day, as they know the Persians are setting up. You say to yourself, well, they're being crazy. We all know what they were doing. They were getting in shape, weren't they? That's what was happening. The Athenians said, if we're going to have to fight them, we're going to be the fittest men we can be. Well, when the big day came, when the Persians arrived at Marathon, what the Athenians did, and I'm keeping this very simple, what the Athenians did was allow the Persians to actually disembark and land on the beach. They allowed the Persians to disembark and land on the beach. And what they saw, which is what they already knew, was that this was only half the Persian fleet. Half of the Persians were going to Marathon. The other half were going to go to Athens and take the city because there was no army there. And so the Persians are divided. And now we're looking at what might be a fair fight. With the Persians at half strength and the Athenians in really good shape, it might not be an even war, but right now we're looking at an even battle. And when the Persians were disembarked on the beach, the next day the Athenians were about a mile out, and what they formed here, and you can see, they just formed a rectangle with one side open, and they just charged the Persians in a very clean formation. And with the Persians thinking these guys are going to run a full mile in their armor, they're going to be worn out by the time they get here. This will be an easy fight. They've got their swords and they're like, all right, bring it on. When the Athenians got there, they were just warmed up. The Persians had their back to the water and the Athenians surrounded them. And what the Persians didn't see was that the Athenian infantry had archers behind them. And so once the Athenians crashed into the Persians, the Athenian archers started sending arrows over their own men into the ranks of the Persians, and the Battle of Marathon was a slaughter. It was an overwhelming Athenian victory. The Persians were completely unprepared because they were arrogant and simply assumed victory was guaranteed. Now understand, this is a Persian army that had never lost a battle in living memory. This is a Persian army that nobody dared ever oppose. So their arrogance is understandable. It was just a serious flaw. After the battle was over, there's still half of the Persian fleet going to Athens. And the Athenians knew this. And so the Athenian commander called for their greatest runner. Who among us is in the very best of shape? And one of them stepped up. And he said, okay, I want you to run to Athens as fast as you can. And the minute you get there, tell them we have won the battle and we are coming. So do not surrender the city. And the legend has it, he ran all the way to Athens, 26 miles after fighting this battle, gave the message that they had won, then fell over and died. And actually, the legend has it that he had been in Sparta the day before the battle and had run there. So this guy had run a lot. And there has even been recreations of this where marathon runners, super runners have started in Sparta, run to the Battle of Marathon, exercised all day like they were fighting a battle, and then ran to Athens. And it can be done. It can be done. You have to be in really good shape, but it can be done. So anyway, the Athenian army then double timed it to Athens. And when the Persian fleet figured out that they had lost at Marathon and the Athenian army was sitting there waiting for them, the fleet just turned around and went back home. Athens wins. That is round one. That is chapter one. Now we can see what's going to happen next. One thing that the Persian emperor will never do is allow himself to be bested like this. This will now give ideas to everybody in the empire. Persia is a very diverse place. Safe to assume there's plenty of unique ethnic groups that would be more than happy to govern themselves, or at least might not be happy with this tax or might not be happy with that law. So there is no way the emperor is going to allow this insult to happen without a response. But Darius died. Darius died. And the new emperor was Xerxes. The new emperor was Xerxes. This was just about 3 or 4 years after Marathon. And Xerxes has something to prove. Not only does Xerxes have to prove that you cannot defeat the Persian emperor, but he has to make a name for himself. He has to sort of plant his flag as a powerful leader since he's new to the throne. So he is extra motivated to make an example of Greece and bring it into the empire so he can have a feather in his cap. Now, we'll stop the lecture real quick. I just want to look at a few things. This here is a battle formation known as the phalanx. Does anybody know what a Greek infantry soldier was called? Does anybody know what a Greek infantry soldier was? He was called a hoplite. The Greek hoplite soldiers. That was the rank and file Greek infantry. And this is a phalanx formation. The Greeks were really the first ancient people to figure out that you can be more effective on a battlefield when you fight in a unit rather than if you fight, as individual. When we look at ancient battles on TV and a lot of movies and stuff, what we see is everybody just sort of charges in and is, slashing and cutting each other like something out of Game of Thrones. That's not how ancient battles really worked. What really would happen is the Greeks would form these very geometrically proper designs, these rectangles or squares of soldiers, and they would all link up together. And you fought as a unit. You did not fight as an individual. And a lot of these armies, basically what would happen on a battlefield is they would just push against each other. And the army that can sort of steamroll over the other is the one that will end up winning. And what happens here is if the guy in front gets killed, everybody just steps up to keep that wall of soldiers going. And so that's sort of how it works. Now, why in this formation would they have really, really long pikes? What would this formation be for? That's for cavalry. That's for killing horses. Okay, and so if the cavalry would charge you, you'd use these giant long spears, and you would shish kebab the horse, and that would take out the cavalry. Yeah, war is hell. Okay, if you feel bad about the horse, keep in mind we're killing people here too. Yeah, and that's funny. We feel worse for the horses than we do for the people getting killed. But hey, that's just who we are as human. Yeah, it's terrible. It's awful. But that's how it is. Now, the Romans, later on, would learn from the Greeks. And the early Roman military would follow the same design. Now, Rome would develop different tactics later on, but early Rome just copied what the Greeks had done. And you'll notice also that their legs are open. They don't have any armor or shielding on their legs. And that's because they don't, they need to be able to move. Right? They don't want, anything to impede their movement. And so they're shielded up here, but on their legs they're not. This is actually, here's another depiction of Greek soldiers there, but this is actually some Greek armor that was found at, you don't see, I'm sorry. This is some Greek armor that was found at the Battle of Marathon. And you can see, we've got the helmet, we've got the breastplate, complete with nipples, right? There's actually a reason for that. It's kind of weird. You would think, why would they do that? But what the Greeks wanted to do is create sort of an illusion that the armor is actually part of your skin, like you're a metal soldier. So it's very form-fitting, and it's because they don't want there to be a distinction between the skin and the armor. So when the enemy sees you, it's sort of psychological. The extent to that's effectiveness, I don't know. But anyway, this is the typical Persian setup. This is how the Persians would have been armed, which of course is sort of similar. Judging by the hat, it appears that the Persians learned how to fight from the Garden Gnome army. That's what that's all about. Oh, we're not there yet. Anyway, let's move forward. Xerxes is going to have to make a statement. He is not going to allow the Athenians to do this to his army. And he has a heck of a lot more than 20,000 men. Now he's going to send the real force. Persia is going to come in heavy. Fun time is over. He puts together an army, and again, these numbers are estimates and based on ancient sources, but he puts together an army of 200,000. And this is the real Persian army. Many of them are conscripts, but many of them are elite soldiers with very real battlefield experience. This is an army that there is no realistic way Athens can defeat. It doesn't matter how well trained they are, it's just too big. It is an army that is so big, it can't go across the water. They have to go overland They have to actually go overland to get there. And so they crossed what is today the Bosphorus, which is where Constantinople is today, but it wasn't then. And then they marched south into Greece. They marched south into Greece. It is very obvious all of Greece is getting conquered here. This is not about Athens. This is about all of them. And once again, Athens turned to Sparta, making it clear we have to fight together. We have to do this together. Everybody knows the Persians are not just after us. If ever there was a time for Greece to unify, now would be it. Even then, they probably can't put together a big enough army, but they can certainly do better than Athens alone. Once again, Sparta refused. Sparta would not help Athens. But Sparta has two kings. Remember that. Sparta doesn't have one king, Sparta has two. And one of their kings, a man by the name of Leonidas, disagreed and joined the Athenians. And the legend has it that he took 300 Spartan soldiers with him. So even though Sparta has a much larger army, Leonidas and the 300 joined with Athens. And remember, Sparta is the best army man for man in the world. The big battle, which was 10,000 Athenians and 300 Spartans versus the 200,000 Persians, was the Battle of Thermopylae. Now, it is spelled a little differently on the study guide. Greek spelling is a little different once we move it into the Latin alphabet, so it's okay if you get the spelling a little off. But the battle was the Battle of Thermopylae, and it was north. It was farther north of Athens as the Persian army was marching into Greece. And it was in a very narrow ravine. The Greeks knew exactly where the Persians would be most vulnerable, and so they found a bottleneck in between some mountains. So the Persians had to be concentrated where they would be easier targets. Well, anyway, there was no way the Greeks were going to win this. Again, the stories tell of, brave fighting, et cetera, And supposedly, when the battle was lost, when it was obvious that the Greeks were done, Leonidas and his 300 men stayed behind, fought until they were all dead, so that the Athenians could get back home and live to fight another day. And so Leonidas and his men sacrificed themselves for the good of the Athenians and for the good of Greece. Here is an old bust of Leonidas, looking rather happy. He's having a good day, apparently. And then there is a modern statue to Leonidas. I don't need to tell you that Leonidas is a superhero to the Greeks today. If you go to the Greek people and say, who is the bravest that has ever lived, who is the greatest Greek ever, it's pretty much universal that they all say Leonidas of Sparta was the greatest of us. He is a national figure because of that leadership and sacrifice. Anyway, at that point, of course, the Persian army moved in on Athens, destroyed the city, just as everyone knew they would. But after that, all of the city-states unified. They all came together and started fighting the Persians as one, led, of course, by Sparta. Led, of course, by Sparta. Now, here's the trick. If you can't be bigger, you got to be smarter, right? The Greeks understood that 200,000 men will get very, very hungry. Is everything okay?
Yeah.
200,000 men will get very, very hungry. 200,000 men take a lot of resources. And so the Athenian army might have been defeated and the city might have been burned, but the Greek navy, particularly the navy of Athens, which was a very good navy, was intact. The navy of Athens was intact. So what the Greeks did, led by Athens on the water, is defeat the Persian fleet, defeat the Persian navy at the Battle of Salamis Bay. The Greeks defeated the Persians at the Battle of Salamis Bay on the water. And the way they were able to do that is by being smarter than the Persians. What they did is they disguised themselves and their ships, making it look like they were not the warships that they were. And they also didn't put soldiers on the ships. They did put soldiers on the ships. And so the Persian sailors sort of sailed into a trap, and all of a sudden the Greeks jumped out with warships, and with the soldiers on the ships, they jumped on the Persian boats and were able to win. So now the Persians are stuck in Greece with no ships to supply them, with no way to get supplies from the home. And the Greek people started destroying everything that could be eaten. They started burning their fields, slaughtering their livestock, realizing that the Persian army is just simply going to be starved. Now understand, if we burn all of our food, we're going to starve, but so will you. That's the trick. This is a technique known as scorched earth. It's a technique known as scorched earth. An army marches on its stomach, and the Greeks knew it. Well, over the course of about a year, things just went from bad to worse for the Persians. The men start starving. The Greeks will not fight them in a one-on-one pitched battle. They engage in guerrilla warfare, and it is guerrilla. Not gorilla like the big monkey, but guerrilla. It's a Spanish term that the Spanish resistance used in their civil war, also against Napoleon. So they're going to harass them. They're going to attack them in tiny little groups. They're going to, jump out from behind the tree and shoot them with an arrow and then run off, that sort of thing. And so the Persian army gets demoralized. They get frustrated. They cannot win. They cannot subdue the Greek spirit. Every day there's fewer and fewer of them. And finally, after about a year of doing this, the Greeks put together one big army and fought the Persians at the Battle of Plataea. And this was a large Greek army with the Persians just frustrated, starving, and really just wanting to go home. And guess who won the Battle of Plataea? The Greeks. Xerxes was defeated, and he and his army withdrew to Persia, humiliated, and clearly not in the mood to ever mess with the Greeks again. Historians consider the Persian War and that unity that the Greeks had as sort of classical Greece at its height. This was the peak of the Greeks being able to work together and celebrate their Greekness. And it also formed a national unity that really has stuck with the Greeks to the present day. And so just like with Leonidas, if you go to the Greek people today and say, what is the greatest victory of the Greek people, or what is the event among you that makes you most proud to be Greek, they would say defeating the Persians. They would say defeating the Persians is that. And there's been all kinds of history before and after then, but you get the idea. Now let's think about this for a minute. Let's analyze what's happening here. One big question that we have to ask ourselves Why was Sparta not willing to help Athens earlier? Why were the Spartans so reluctant? They clearly understood what was happening. Now, there is no exact answer, I'll tell you that. We don't know for sure. But there is a lot of speculation on it, and even ancient sources speculated on it too. So I'll ask you, what might Sparta's motivation have been? Now we're thinking. Yeah, now we're thinking. Okay, Sparta was certainly smart enough to know that we're going to end up fighting the Persians. It's going to happen whether we want to or not. The Spartans don't fear anybody. And the Spartans probably understood the problem that Xerxes was always going to have, which is that he won't be able to feed his army. Sooner or later, if we just keep up the fight, these guys will have to go home. So, if we're going to be Spartans and we're going to be sneaky about it, here's an idea. Let's let Persia defeat our biggest rival. Then we can step in, organize the Greek people, and save the day. Right? So when the war is over, we're in a position to be dominant. That's exactly right. If they worked with the Athenians earlier on, then the Persians get defeated and we're still rivals with Athens, aren't we? And so let's take out a group of folks that we would like to knock down a peg or two. Use this as an opportunity. Use this as an opportunity. Now that's the best speculation. That's what historians typically go with. Now, the real reason, nobody really knows, but we can see that happening. We can see that happening. The one thing we need to understand about Sparta is Sparta never feared anybody. The Spartans did not care how big the enemy was. As far as they were concerned, there's always a path to victory. There's always a path to victory. Even at the height of Rome, when the Roman Empire was at its zenith, Sparta still remained largely independent. The Romans even left the Spartans alone. Well, the Greeks agreed when the Persians were finished that they would team up, that they would form an alliance to agree that if the Persians ever invaded again, which from their perspective would certainly be a possibility, they wouldn't have any internal discord. They would immediately unify and they would immediately work together. But there was a lot of bad blood. There was a lot of bad blood. The Athenians were not happy with how the Spartans had played them. The Athenians were angry that their city-state had gotten destroyed, but none of the others had. That it took the destruction of their city to put Greece on a unified team. And of course, the Spartans were doing exactly what we would expect. They were trying to dominate the Greek people now. Sparta had led this war, and Sparta was going to get the benefit of it. So instead of one alliance, the Greeks ended up forming two. Instead of one alliance, the Greeks ended up forming two. One alliance would be called the Delian League. And it was led by Athens. The other, the Peloponnesian League. The other, the Peloponnesian League. And it was led by Sparta. And of course, they didn't trust each other. They didn't really like each other. They feared the strength of each side. So sooner or later, we can see what's going to happen with that, can't we? Now, we're not going to get there just yet because in the little time we have left, I just want to show you all a little bit. This here is a model of the Athenian Acropolis. Now, every Greek city-state had an Acropolis. It was sort of the town center of their capital. And it was the business center, the government center, the intellectual center. You get the idea. And the most preserved of all of these is the one at Athens. And the most famous Greek building in the world, one of the famous buildings in the world, bar none, is this right here known as the Parthenon. This right here known as the Parthenon. And it was a temple at the top of the Athenian Acropolis. And all around it were these other beautiful marble buildings. And this represented the Greek worldview. It is the perfect building. And the reason it's the perfect building is because it's so well balanced. The idea is to balance the architecture, turn it into a work of art, but also a functional building, et cetera, et cetera. And so many buildings today, in one way or another, are based on the Parthenon. The porch with the columns, and you get the idea. And so this building has been the model around which countless other structures have been built, invoking that spirit of ancient Greece. Now, the building itself shouldn't look like this. Obviously it's a ruins today. It was pretty much intact. It was actually in pretty good shape until the 17th century. In the 1600s, Greece was at war with the Ottoman Empire, and they were storing munitions in the Parthenon. And the Ottoman fleet pulled up, it starts sending cannonballs into the city, and one hit the Parthenon, and the gunpowder went up, and it blew the building to smithereens. And so that's actually why the Parthenon looks as it did. It didn't just crumble over the years. The Greeks had always loved this building. And it's a darn shame, but there's actually a little bit more to it than that. In the early 1800s, as ancient Greece is being celebrated and studied even more, a British nobleman who was himself a scholar of sorts, a man by the name of Lord Elgin, made a deal with the Turkish Sultan to remove the statues that were on top around the Parthenon and many other statues from the Acropolis. At the time, Greece was part of the Ottoman Empire, so the Turkish Sultan was theoretically the ruler of Greece, and he gave Lord Elgin permission to send in stonecutters and take all of these statues away. And so that's exactly what Elgin did. And so he sent a whole team in there, and they meticulously removed all of the friezes from around the top. And you can see up around the top, there used to be friezes and statues all up around there, and some of them were actually still in pretty good shape despite the explosion. Needless to say, these stonecutters did a lot of damage whenever they removed them. But an entire wing of the British Museum has now been dedicated. It's known as the Elgin Wing. And you can see the Parthenon up close, all of these friezes and statues. At least what has survived. And they're in very, very bad shape given all they've been to. Being out in the elements for hundreds and hundreds of years and then getting blown up and then getting removed. There's also a lot of controversy over how the British preserved them. Some believe that there was work done to clean them, and they used chisels and stuff, which certainly is not good. Now, we'll close with a very brief discussion of what immediately comes to mind when you think of these statues and the British having them. After all that we've talked about with the Greeks being proud of the Persian War and proud of their classical era, what might come to mind? I'm sorry? Well, in terms of these friezes themselves. How about the fact that the Greeks want them back? Right? How about the fact that the Greeks are kind of insulted, by the British ever taking them to begin with? Remember, the Greeks never gave permission to take their greatest works of art that they are the most proud of, which is the statues at the Athenian Acropolis. It was a Turkish Sultan that said that they could be removed. And there's even controversy over whether or not he really did that, or really, he understood what he was doing. And so ever since then, the Greeks have demanded that the British return their statues to them. And the British simply won't do it. Now, the real question that also brings up, or a deeper question that brings up, is who really owns these? Right? Because, of course, the British would say, we did take them legitimately. We did take them fair and square. We had legal permission at the time. Even if it wasn't the legal permission you would have wanted, the law is the law. The British would argue that these really belong to the world. These statues represent the formation of Western culture and Western civilization, of which, millions of people around the world are a part of. And so the Greeks can't really lay claim to ownership of this anymore. But that's a real convenient argument since they were the ones holding the statues, right? The Greeks are like, they're still ours. The British also argue, of course, that they're in good hands, that they're being well cared for. And if they transferred them to Greece, they could be damaged. How do we know the Greeks will take good care of them? Suffice to say, the Greeks will do everything possible to take good care of them. London was bombed pretty heavily during World War II. It's not like they're guaranteed to be safe there. Plus, the cleaning that the British had done was not exactly good either. So, that's kind of a weak argument. What would happen, though, and we're getting kind of back to the idea of that slippery slope that we mentioned earlier on. In the event that the British did go ahead and give the Greeks their statues back, all of the other people around the world that the British took stuff from are going to say, we want it back too. The Egyptians have wanted the Rosetta Stone for decades, right? And there's all kinds of Egyptian artifacts that are in the British Museum too. And those were taken under very, controversial circumstances. There's African art, there's South American art, there's Asian art from all over. I mean, the Indian art in the British Museum, because Britain, of course, ruled India. All of that is just amazing, and they want that back. So the British are real touchy about this. If we give one thing back, everybody's going to want it back. And the British Museum is a magnificent place. It's one of the greatest museums in the world. You can see everything about human civilization by going through the British Museum. And so it's a really awesome place. I think we could safely say that what this really gets down to is an argument about money, because it's about tourism and people show up to see this. The British Museum is one of the busiest museums in the world. Lots of people go to London to see this. So I don't know. You can decide for yourself. And I am going on this a little bit because it is one of our discussion topics this week, in case you haven't checked it out. So I want you to be able to weigh in on that. Hey, give me a clear answer on what you think should be done. And regardless of where these are, going to the British Museum or seeing these artifacts absolutely needs to be on your bucket list. Okay, this is something that you have to see, because we are Western people, and this is important to us. Okay, stay safe from Sally. Okay, looks like it's basically going to be flooding, but nevertheless, I want you to be prepared. And I don't know what will be going on. If I had to guess, I would say we would probably be open on Wednesday, but we just don't know. So follow along, and I will talk to everybody soon.